this computer. Yes. All right. And don't show this again. Well, welcome everybody. Now that I have you here, thank you all for signing up. Like, there are literally hundreds of people who are going to be watching the recording. I guess this wasn't a great time for people, but the people who are here in person, welcome. And I appreciate your being here. We are getting started here on the dot. What I forgot to mention is this is part one. These 2 hours of part one. I got so carried away. Hello, Therese. I got so carried away with all of what I was learning that I eventually realized I have to have different parts. So this is part one. So let me just now see if I can share my screen. I'm a little panicked here because this didn't. Okay, good, good. Let me just see. Okay, share. Do you see it? But yes, nod if you do. Oh, yes, and Martha's a thumb up. All right, and let me just move this and let me just get this right. And meanwhile, I'm looking at a million other things that I want to get rid of. And I'm even going to get rid of that. Oops. And I'm going to show this. And I'm going to make it bigger so that I can see it and you all now can see it. And as it happens, I now have access to the chat because I figured out how to do that. Joel, I see your appointment book. Not you, but I see your appointment book. All right, so this is called The Ache That Won't Let Go, Illuminating the Dynamics of Neurosis and Narcissism, and The Enigma of Relentless Ambivalence and Relentless Hope, Part 1. All right, relentless ambivalence. Model 1, that's something new. I'd never really quite conceptualized it in that way. And I'm going to say here, the neurotic refusal to commit, to decide one way or the other. Wait, let me just do something here. Right. Okay. I want to be able to see this. Okay. To decide one way or the other. And that's model 1. So model 1 is we're going to see. So for those who do or don't know, the START method of psychodynamic synergy is a story about 5 modes of therapeutic action. And I'm going to give the N words for all 5 for the moment. So model 1 is more about neurotic dynamics. Model 2, so model 1, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis, is more about neurotic dynamics. That's model 1. Model 2, the corrective provision perspective of self-psychology, is more a story about narcissistic dynamics. Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, is more a story about noxious relatedness. And model 4, an existential humanistic approach to easing relentless despair and facilitating surrender to analytic oneness, in the words of Ephra Eshel. That one is more about lifting from Arne Modell, non-relatedness. And model 5 is when model 1, 2, 3, and 4, in those moments when the patient is not model 1 aware, not model 2 accepting, not model 3 accountable, not model 4 accessible or available, but rather non-acting, non-actualizing. So those are the N words: neurotic, narcissistic, noxiously related, non-related, and non-action, non-actualizing. And we all have all 5, though we will tend to have a predominance of one over the others, although that can change over time. All right, so back to the slides. Relentless ambivalence, model 1, the neurotic refusal to commit, to decide one way or the other. We're going to be saying a lot more about that. And then we have model 2, relentless hope, the narcissistic refusal to accept, to confront and grieve the reality of the object's limitations, separateness, and immutability. So neurotic, model 1, narcissistic, model 2. Both relentless ambivalence, which characterizes model 1 patients with neurotic dynamics, and relentless hope, which characterizes Model 2 patients with narcissistic dynamics, fuel an ache at the core of the self that refuses to let go. Life is a balance between holding on and letting go. By Rumi. Rumi, beautiful. Okay, so we'll be talking about, and at this point it's sort of like, huh? But we're going to be talking about Model 1, neurotic drive object transferences, and narcissistic self-object transferences, the two of them being really quite different and targeting, as we've already been suggesting, different dynamics in the patient. Okay, so neurotic drive object transferences, that is actually a hyphenated word, versus narcissistic self-object, that's become one word over time, self-object transferences. So experiencing the therapist as a drive object, tasked with gratifying or frustrating drives, which is Model 1 of the Stark method, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis, versus experiencing the therapist as a self-object, tasked with reinforcing self-esteem, very different, which is Model 2 of the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy, the corrective provision or deficiency compensation perspective of self-psychology. Now, for those of you who know me, you will know why this is my favorite slide of all. I almost don't even know if I want to tell you who these are. But anyway, their song, and some of you are thinking, oh, yeah, I know who they are. And others of you are thinking, huh? But anyway, their fan base, these five guys, serves as a self-esteem enhancing self-object. And their song goes, all you people, can't you see how your love's affecting our reality? Because every time we're down, you can make it right, and that makes you larger than life. Every time we're down, you can make it right, and that makes you larger than life. I need somebody to put in the chat who these people are, these five guys, and I see so far, don't be shy. But anyway, so there they are. They sing that song. Okay, so overview. Oh, okay, Myra. Thank you, Myra. And Donna Mahoney. Thank you. Backstreet Boys, folks. Thank you. All right. Whenever they come to town, or even when they're not in my town, I go to see them. I love them, as people know. And later I'm going to be talking about what are some of the things that we do in our lives that we commit to, about which we are 100% unambivalent. Remember Model 1, relentless ambivalence. So for all of us to be thinking about those things we're ambivalent about, but also to be thinking about those things, those cherished things that we are unambivalent about and we 100% embrace. For me, the Backstreet Boys. I don't care if it's the teenagers are into the Backstreet Boys. I am into the Backstreet Boys. There you go. Okay, so overview for neurosis. Neurosis is the inner torment of a divided self caught in chronic tension, often unconscious, between opposing internal forces, forces struggling to break free, and resistant counter forces that rise up in protest. So, for example, a repressed wish or forbidden desire on the one hand, and a harsh, prohibitive internal authority on the other, resulting in the persistent deployment by the ego of defensive strategies or compromise formations that simultaneously express and conceal the unresolved longing and fuel the anguished suffering. A private pain the patient feels profoundly, although usually no one else can see it. It's about the private suffering of someone with neurotic dynamics. So the internal ache of relentless ambivalence and an often paralyzing reluctance to commit. Overview for narcissism. Narcissism, excuse me, is the heartbreaking struggle of a vulnerable self, striving to complete itself in order to feel worthy and whole in the wake of early relational injuries or empathic failures. It is the plight of a self that, in the absence of reliable mirroring and attuned empathic recognition, in other words, caregiving functions, caregiving psychological functions, and in an effort to compensate for that developmental lack, is the self, the vulnerable self, the fragmented, the fragile self, is compelled to seek narcissistic supplies from idealized others. Think about in those moments, the Backstreet Boys, and think about for all of us in those moments when. So figures, idealized others, figures unconsciously recruited to restore self-esteem and to protect against the shame, emptiness, and fragmentation that would otherwise threaten to overwhelm its fragile core. Narcissistic strategies designed to appease the gnawing ache of relentless hope and the deep reluctance to accept the limitations, separateness, and immutability of those who could never and will never fully meet its longing. Indeed, Model 1 of the Stark Method, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis, features the structural conflicts of patients with neurotic features, distinct from Model 2 of the Stark Method, the corrective provision or deficiency compensation perspective of self-psychology, which features the structural deficits, not structural conflicts, but now structural deficits. And as you will see, Model 3 is about relational conflicts, and Model 4 is about relational deficits. And this is where I always say thanks to Larry Hedges, who made me, who knew my work well enough to know what was missing. I had Model 1, structural conflict, Model 2, structural deficit, Model 3, relational conflict. And Larry Hedges, bless his soul, again, knew my work well enough to know, Martha, you have to have relational deficit. So I finally, all right, put in Model 4, which is probably one of the best things I've ever done. So structural conflict, Model 1, structural deficit, Model 2, relational conflict, Model 3, and relational deficit, Model 4. Okay. So where am I? Okay, Model 2, the corrective provision perspective of self-psychology, which features the structural deficits of patients with narcissistic features. These are not necessarily two different patients, but two shifting focal points, or in the words of one of my mentors, Robert Melman, the point or points of emotional urgency, what it is that sort of most matters to the patient in that moment. So not necessarily two different patients, but two shifting focal points in the unfolding treatment of a single patient. All right, so whereas narcissism, I'm going to be doing neurosis first, but a few more, I think, comparisons here. Whereas narcissism compels deficit-ridden, deficit-laden individuals to relate to others as self-objects, one word, no hyphen even, that is, as extensions of the self charged with stabilizing self-esteem. Neurosis prompts conflict-ridden or conflict-laden individuals to relate to others as drive objects, figures onto whom instinctual impulses are displaced and moral superego prohibitions projected. Displacement of drive, and a lot of people just, and one of my other mentors, Bill Meissner, sort of taught me about this one because I didn't understand about with neurotic transferences, like sometimes it's displacement, right? But sometimes projection, right? And he said, yes, both, one and or the other. Thank you. And when Bill said one end or the other, I figure, all righty then, so be it. So displacement of drive, envision that in your head. Displacement of drive refers to the redirection of an impulse, such as a libidinal yearning, I want my daddy, or an aggressive impulse, an aggressive urge, I want to do away with my mom. Um, Away from its original target, my daddy and my mommy, and onto a substitute figure, the therapist. The drive remains intact, but its object will have shifted. That's what displacement means. A lot of people just sort of don't kind of think about displacement. That's displacement. You displace, you shift the object of your drive. In the clinical setting, this often means that the therapist becomes the new, unconscious, often unconscious, recipient of these redirected, so displacement means redirected, libidinal or derivatives of libidinal and aggressive or derivatives of aggressive drives. By contrast, that was displacement. Projection of prohibition, think superego, involves the externalization of internal moral restraints, such as judgment, criticism, disapproval, condemnation, that are banished from within and assigned to the outside world. In the clinical setting, this often means that the therapist is unconsciously cast as a critical, judgmental, or shaming figure, a reflection of the patient's own superego injunctions and ego ideal standards. Now, I don't emphasize in Model 1 as much the ego ideal standards, but technically they are also relevant there. Though I don't tend to emphasize that, and I tend to put that more in Model 2, self-psychology, the ambitions and purposes of the ego, the goals and aspirations of the ego ideal, Model 2, narcissism. But anyway, back to Model 1. So the therapist cast as, right, a reflection of the patient's own superego injunctions, the inner voice of thou shalt not, a moral prohibition imposed by the superego proper is what we used to call it, that is, by the conscience, and the ego ideal standards, the thou shalt, an aspirational mandate issued by the ego ideal, an internalized standard for who one strives to become. In other words, the superego proper, which sort of so the superego, on some would say, includes the superego proper or the conscience and the ego ideal. Okay. In other words, the superego proper, the conscience, speaks in the voice of thou shalt not, a moral prohibition, whereas the ego ideal represents the voice of thou shalt, a vision of perfection to which the self aspires. Now, with respect to the neurotic transference that will emerge when drives are displaced, redirected, and or prohibitions projected, please note, classical psychoanalysis, grounded in a one-person psychology, cautions that the integrity of an analytic treatment and the uncontaminated purity of a neurotic transference can be seriously compromised by countertransferential reactivity on the part of the analyst. Now, let me just say, in Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, think Jessica Benjamin, Stephen Mitchell, Jay Greenberg, Adrian Harris, and Darlene Ehrenberg, and many others, in Model 3, the countertransference, i.e., the therapist's reactivity, is thought to be an incredibly important aspect of coming to know the patient and can be used in the best interests of the patient and of the ongoing treatment. In Model 1, countertransference is thought to be not a good thing. And if back in my day when I was being trained, if there was ever the thought, the glimmering of countertransference, it's sort of like get thyself off to thy therapy to get rid of thy countertransference, because that interferes with the concept of an uncontaminated, untainted neurotic transference. So that was then, but things have evolved since then. And so from Model 1, which for me, I learned all about in the 1970s. Model 2, self-psychology, I learned all about in the 1980s, so made a model. Model 3, the 1990s, I learned all about that in the 1990s, William Allenson White Institute and them other folks who were busy talking about the here and now of the therapeutic or analytic engagement. And then model 4 from 2000 to 2010. And then model 5 from 2010 to 2020. And people have heard me say this, but model 6, which is still a little more virtual than actual, is going to be my somatic-spiritual approach to mind-body health. And everybody says, oh, do it now. But sort of like, I'm not evolved enough. I got the body part probably down okay. But the spiritual part, I got some more. I get this decade, 2020 to 2030. So give me a little time here. All right, but anyway. All right, so what am I saying? Classical psychoanalysis, the purity of a neurotic transference can be seriously jeopardized by countertransference. The analyst is therefore, in Model 1 in classical psychoanalytic theory, advised to maintain neutrality, to approach the clinical encounter with the objectivity and dispassionate precision of a surgeon, and to provide the patient with a blank screen onto which the patient will inevitably displace and project unresolved early relational dynamics, which can then be interpreted as stories primarily about the patient and the patient's unmastered early relational experiences. Now, let me say here, this is where people will say, surely there's never really a pure projection. Rather, the therapist's countertransference is almost always involved on some level. So I say to you, over the course of the last week or the last month, how many times has your countertransference interfered with what would otherwise have been pure projection? I mean, interesting to think about that theoretically, sort of, nah, there's no such thing as a unilateral transference, pure projection. No. Surely the subjectivity of the therapist is always being introduced on some level and contaminating what happens in the here and now of the analytic encounter. So like, well, okay. So again, think about when you have been drawn into participating perhaps as somewhat critical, as somewhat demanding, as somewhat judgmental, for example. So it's kind of interesting, the difference between theory and clinical practice. Okay, here we go. Okay, displacement of id drives, seeking expression or release will give rise to a positive neurotic transference. And because there's some expectation of some form of gratification. Sort of like, well, maybe my daddy, maybe my therapist, maybe my therapist will, will have a little special something like that we didn't have, that I didn't have with my dad, who still had mom. Right, so maybe my therapist. So there's the sort of expectation of some form of gratification. Now, projection of superego prohibitions seeking to restrict or punish will give rise to a negative neurotic transference and the anticipation of some form of punishment, criticism, judgment, or frustration. Therefore, the dialectic at the heart of neurotic transference is this exquisite tension between longing and fear, hope and dread, id and superego, with the ego, this is classical psychoanalytic theory, the ego needing to, the beleaguered ego, trying to mediate between the demands of id and superego and external reality. All right, so later or soon or whenever, I'm going to be talking more about the conflict at the heart of neurotic suffering is, can I be bad or must I be good? Can I defy or must I comply? So it's defiance versus compliance. And I believe that Andres Angel, in a somewhat different way, has talked about that. Or if not Michaels and Mickelson, I should have checked that, but someone else had talked about that in a slightly different way, but I really loved the defiance versus compliance. So I'll have to check that, and forgive me. Okay, but whether it be displacement of drive or projection of prohibition, in classical psychoanalytic theory, the patient's transferential experience of the therapist, if not tainted or jeopardized by the therapist's participation, is understood to be a story not about the therapist, but about the patient's inner world, developmental history, and early relational patterns. Themes, motifs, complexes, narratives even, although most of the classical folks, except Roy Schaefer, but don't really talk about narratives per se. Those for me fit more into Model 3 and Model 5. But anyway, I see I put it here. Themes, motifs, complexes, narratives, the Oedipus complex, for example, that have been reactivated. This is the transference, the patient's transferential experience. Themes, motifs, complexes that have been reactivated in the therapeutic relationship, now ripe for interpretation. Model 1 is about interpretation. Classical psychoanalytics, about insight. I call it awareness because I believe the adaptations all have to start with an A. So insight doesn't start with an A. So I go with awareness, self-reflective, introspective awareness. Insight is the goal. Go from resistance to awareness. Model 1, that's the therapeutic action. Anyway, Model 1 interpretation and Model 2, as we'll be developing a little more later on, is primarily a story about grieving against the backdrop of wonderful empathic attunement and all sorts of good, wonderful holding. But the structural change results from grieving. All right, we'll get to that later. I'm leaping ahead. All right, so now Model 1, ripe for interpretation. So Model 1 is a little more cognitive. It does other things too, but it privileges cognition. Interpretation. It just does. That's what Freud did. Hey, listen, Freud was there way before we were born and doing some brilliant stuff, which at the time was thought to be like, oh, wow. And brilliant. I mean, there are things he didn't get to. I mean, fair enough. I mean, nowadays we have all sorts of things. There's version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4. So there are different versions of Freud's classical psychoanalytic, but it's amazing how much has still stood the test of time. Anyway, now ripe for interpretation. And I think we can all feel really good when we have offered the patient an interpretation and highlighted how unresolved and unmastered relational experiences from early on, developmentally, how because they're unresolved, unmastered, they're now being played out in the transference. And we interpret that. And we are so very proud of ourselves that we have helped the patient to see what we are becoming aware of, which is they have either displaced and or projected and are now misperceiving us as something that we're not. Unless a little bit we are, in which case we're talking Model 3, where we've been drawn into participating countertransferentially in the patient's transferential enactment. Anyway, back to this. Model 1, now ripe for interpretation, modification, and eventual integration into the patient's evolving psychic organization. Classical psychoanalytic theory. My Model 1 takes off from that, but then goes on to do something a little different, but informed by classical psychoanalytic theory. Okay, in keeping with the classical concept of analytic neutrality, so Model 1 of the Stark method, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis, comes into play, I see this as repeat, when the patient is simply experiencing the therapist as, say, critical. In other words, when the therapist has remained neutral and is not participating countertransferentially as a critic. We are now talking about pure projection, which will be interpreted for what it is, namely, as a story about the patient and what the patient is bringing from the past into the therapeutic relationship. Indeed, interpretation of projection lies at the heart of the therapeutic action in classical psychoanalysis, as does the complementary interpretation of displacement. Okay, by way of an example of pure projection, this is a lovely one. This happened recently. A patient of mine, upon hearing me answer the phone at the time of our appointment, I do it by phone with her, not Zoom, I do it by telephone. Upon hearing me answer the phone at the time of our appointment with a warm and expectant hello, responded, "You sounded surprised." Okay, relevant data points. I have worked with this patient weekly for over 8 years. She always calls precisely on the dot I always answer precisely on the dot. She had called on the dot that day, and I had answered on the dot that day. And yet she said, "You sounded surprised." So my clinical formulation, this was a moment of pure projection. The direct externalization of a disavowed psychic fragment. This was not an instance, because so many are contaminated. I do believe that. Model 3, yes, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory that understands things as being a story not about pure projection, one person orientation, but rather projective identification with participation by both patient and therapist, from both patient and therapist, co-constructed, co-created experience. Model 3. All right, but we're back to Model 1. So in this case, it was not an instance of co-created projective identification. And again, think about how often do you, even though sort of like, oh yeah, yep, Model 3, yep, I'm always contributing. How often have you, in some way or another, one, let yourself know that you were experiencing all sorts of stuff countertransferentially, and or so that's afferent, what comes your way. So like, oh wow, I think I'm reacting internally, whoa. And or efferently, how often have you then responded, not just come to know, but responded in a way that it highlighted the fact of you're having complicated things with your countertransferential reactivity, such that it's now Model 3 become a mutual enactment, a transference, countertransference, entanglement. But that's Model 3. And Model 1, where, and in my spot supervision Zoom sessions, which I do, by the way, on almost every Thursday, except during the summer, but we start again in September. They're entirely free. They're both live and recorded. It's rare that clinicians will acknowledge, although the thing that comes to mind for me immediately is Jenny. Jenny actually did a beautiful job of acknowledging, but not to be outing Jenny, but whatever. Anyway, of acknowledging their countertransferential reactivity. Usually it's sort of like, well, I made a brilliant interpretation. I highlighted this, that's what, whatever. Sort of like, oh, that's good. That's Model 1. And that's good. That's fine. There's a place for all of these. All right, anyway, my clinical formulation, this was a moment of pure projection, the direct externalization of a disavowed psychic fragment. This was not an instance of co-constructed, co-created projective identification, a two-person orientation. There was no mutual enactment, no contribution from my side. There was not an ounce of truth in what she was alleging. Clinical resolution. Once we explored her distorted perception of me as having been surprised, my patient as well came to appreciate that the idea of being surprised had in fact originated from within her and been projected onto me. We then traced this projection back to a series of traumatic childhood moments when she had quite literally been forgotten, lost track of by her mother. My patient's "you sounded surprised" was not at all about me, but a reverberation of that forgotten child's heartbreak. A psychic fragment disavowed and projected into the analytic field, where it was briefly, until we interpreted it, mistaken for reality, until it could be interpreted for what it really was. The next slide, I'm sorry, I just thought of something that I want to make sure to get said when it belongs. Okay, the next slide presents the Model 1 conflict statement, or a reasonable facsimile thereof. So I had a chance to kind of tweak it a little bit, that I ultimately offered my patient as an interpretation of her distorted perception of me. So later, now or in part 2 or sometime, I'm going to be talking much more about optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences created by conflict statements that in essence are efforts to give the patient an optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experience, the working through and resolution of which will be the way in which, step by step by step, incrementally, the patient will evolve from defense to adaptation, from rigid defense to more resilient adaptation. I'm leaping ahead of myself there. But anyway, those are conflict statements, lifting from all of what I was trained in classical psychoanalytic theory at the Boston Psychoanalytic back in the 1970s. Yes, I have gone on to modify it a little bit with a relatively cognitive conflict statement, Model 1. Although here is what I just about almost offered my patient, or a reasonable facsimile thereof. Okay, it's sort of been photoshopped a little bit. On some level, you knew that I wasn't actually surprised to hear from you because you always call me on time and I've always been there to pick right up. Now, did she know that? Well, that's a fact. She's not psychotic and sort of like, yeah, okay, yeah, she did know that. Being reminded of that, does that on some level make her a little bit anxious? Well, a little bit, because it's counter to it, it's in opposition to what her assumption was. Her conditioned reaction was, you sounded surprised. All right, so let me read that again. So this first half of the conflict statement was a bit of a challenge. Anxiety provoking. Okay. On some level, you knew that I wasn't actually surprised to hear from you because you always call me on time and I've always been there to pick right up. But deep down, you were afraid that maybe I, just like your mother had so painfully done all those many times when you were young and so very vulnerable, that maybe I, too, might have lost track of you, even forgotten that we were to be having our time together. I was attempting to create a growth incentivizing by juxtaposing anxiety provoking challenge of her defensive projection with anxiety assuaging, empathic resonating with her defensive need, which was to assume that I, too, like her mother before her, would have forgotten and lost track of her. So I was attempting to create an optimally stressful, which means increase the anxiety and then decrease it, and a series of disruptions occasioned by the anxiety-provoking challenge, and then recovery or repair facilitated by the anxiety assuaging support of the therapist, and by tapping into the patient's underlying resilience and adaptive capacity in the face of optimal stress. So we're ever busy optimally stressing our patients to evolve them through gradually, iteratively, through healing cycles of disruption in response to anxiety, and then repair or recovery or restabilization in response to support, the therapist support. Conflict statement does also provide support, witness the second half, and by tapping into the patient's underlying resilience. I believe profoundly in the underlying resilience of our patients. I just do. I do. All right. All right. By offering an optimally stressful conflict statement, Model 1, that's sensitively balanced, anxiety provoking, yet respectful challenge of her distorted perception of me. You want to do it carefully. You don't want to say, like, my God, what were you thinking? I'm always here. So why in the world would you have distorted your perception of me? Obviously, you don't do it that way. It's a respectful, gentle challenge, and based on your sense of the alliance that you have and the holding that's there, to what extent will the patient be able to tolerate your optimally stressful, anxiety-provoking challenge? Okay. So that by offering that this statement that sensitively balanced, anxiety-provoking yet respectful challenge of her distorted perception of me with anxiety assuaging and compassionately non-judgmental support or validation of that developmentally understandable misperception. Now, notice, and people will often imagine that validation means confirming. Validation, and here I'm just lifting from what Bob Stollerow used to describe as the empathic stance, which is a decentering the therapist from their own subjectivity and a joining alongside the patient and taking on the patient's subjective experience, but only as if it were your own. It never actually becomes your own because you have decentered from your subjectivity and you're joining alongside the patient and taking on their experience, but only as if it were your own. So when you are basically validating your understanding, anxiety assuaging. I say support because I talk challenge and support, but maybe I would want to say, oh, I did say understandable, understanding. And maybe I should add the word understanding, that developmentally understandable misperception. Like you totally get it. It's not like sort of like, huh? Boy, that's weird. But sort of like you really get it. That as a child, and you put in affect. Just like your mother had so painfully done all those many times when you were young and so very vulnerable, that maybe I too might have lost track of you, even forgotten that we were to be having our time together. So there you're really attempting to just be present with her in her pain. And as you say it, you can feel it. You're not, yes, I felt it. Yes. And she could feel me feeling it. Often, however, yes, pure projection, which involves simply distorted perception, like what had happened there, becomes tainted by projective identification, a dynamic that now implicates both patient and therapist. In fact, it is generally understood that even when guided by the ideal of analytic neutrality or therapeutic neutrality, the therapist is not impervious to being emotionally drawn in. Like, let's get real here, such that over time, what might have begun as a situation of pure projection, a misperception fueled entirely by the patient's developmental history, unresolved developmental relational dynamics, will gradually shift from a one-person, model one, to a two-person dynamic. Thus, what begins as pure projection, shaped by the patient's inner experience, evolves into a more complex, co-constructed reality, a mutually charged relational field, relational matrix, in which both patient and therapist are now participants. All right, now let me say, I have now several times said, Model 1 is a one-person psychology. Model 3 is a two-person psychology. Well, what about Model 2? And that's where I pick up on, although Andy Morrison told me later that it wasn't entirely what he meant to be saying, but I'm going to pick up on his concept of a 1.5-person psychology. So, Model 3, we will see, though that's not the focus of my presentation today, Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, and they've been faulted sometimes for seeing the unconscious as a black box. I don't go with that, but that's the way they get faulted sometimes. Just as Model 1, they get faulted for sort of like, get real, what about the relationship? So each approach gets faulted for something. You can't please all the people all the time. All right, but anyway, so Model 3, the two-person perspective, all right, is really intersubjective. Two authentic subjects in relationship with each other. Give and take, give and take, give and take, give and take. And I think of like a ping pong game, or maybe pickleball nowadays, since that's the thing. But anyway, being played with two balls at the same time, each a server. Boom, 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 boom. A two-person. It's about give and take. Model 2, on the other hand, the corrective provision perspective of self-psychology, is more a story about give. The therapist, self-object therapist, gives. And the patient, for the most part, unambivalently accepts. Yes. The problem being when there are these momentary lapses on the part of the therapist, lapses that are inevitable, necessary and therefore desirable. In the aftermath of these lapses, what had been a positive narcissistic self-object transference becomes a disrupted one, which needs to be, that disillusionment needs to be worked through and grieved, which will, I'm leaping ahead, which will provide impetus and opportunity. Model 2, disillusionment, the disruption of the positive self-object transference, will provide impetus and opportunity for there to be adaptive, not defensive, but adaptive, transmuting, which means structure building or capacity enhancement, internalizations of the good that had been there prior to the failure. All right, so in any event, a little bit, can you see, model 2 is more a 1.5-person psychology. It's a story about give. Model 3 is 2-person, a story about give and take. And model 1 does not specifically focus on the relationship per se. Okay. Okay, good. Well, all right, I think I did that page. All right, so okay, model 3, again, I guess we're doing the projective identification for the moment. A co-created messiness, in the very felicitous words of Ed Tronick, that will need to be negotiated at Darlene Ehrenberg's intimate edge in order to resolve not only model 1, structural conflict, but also model 3, relational conflict. So again, model 1, structural conflict, model 2, structural deficit, model 3, relational conflict, and model 4, relational deficit. Thank you, Larry Hedges. All right, at which point the focus begins to shift, where there's been contributions from both, from the one-person orientation of model 1, the interpretive stance of classical psychoanalysis, interpretation of pure projection as primarily the patient's story, to the two-person orientation of model 3, the intersubjective stance of contemporary relational theory. Just think William Allenson White Institute, and plenty of other places too, but that's what I always think. Negotiation of co-created projective identification as a story co-authored by both patient and therapist. Let me say now for a moment, there are numbers of people, I think it's a little more on the East Coast than on the West Coast, but as I understand it, numbers of people who sort of don't like the concept of projective identification. And whereas on the West Coast, I think they do. And I'm on the East Coast and I like the concept, but whatever. That's because I've read a lot of Ogden, Malin and Grotstein, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the thought is that if you're not careful, projective identification is sort of making it be the patient who started it. The patient who projects something, a disavowed psychic fragment, projects it, and then is sort of distorted in their perception of the therapist, and then exerts, as it's called, Ogden calls it this, some of the others do as well, interpersonal pressure on the therapist to accept the projection, at which point, I call that the induction phase, that's my word, induction phase of a projective identification. That's the first half, at which point the therapist actually begins to participate as some version of what the patient had sort of feared, imagined, kind of needed the therapist to participate as. And then, though, the therapist, model 3, by virtue of their own more evolved capacity to sit with, to tolerate, to process, metabolize, digest, that has been put into them, and that they, quite frankly, had sort of begun to act out or enact or reenact on the stage of the treatment, the therapist is able to process and integrate their toxicity and return to the patient, that's the resolution phase, some version of the original projection. And so the idea being, but wait a minute, the patient started it, it's not fair to be sort of saying that. But what I want to say is, okay, you got to start talking about it somewhere. But I know that the reason the patient started it would probably be a reaction to something prior to that the therapist had done or not done, had said or not said. It's an ongoing model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory is a story about those two ping pong balls back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth all the time, and negotiating at the intimate edge. It being understood that it's a story about and again, remember the N words, Model 1, neurotic. Model 2, narcissistic. Model 3, noxious relatedness, contentious, but contentious starts with a C. So noxious relatedness. Model 4, non-relatedness. And Model 5, non-action. So Model 3, the noxious relatedness, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and negotiating at the intimate edge. That. Okie dokie. All right, so moving on. More specifically, once the therapist begins to react countertransferentially to the patient's transferential reenactment and becomes emotionally drawn in, participating perhaps as, say, a critical figure, then what had previously involved pure projection, unilateral transference, and the intrapsychic dynamics of the patient, a situation amenable to Model 1 interpretive work, will now evolve into co-created, co-constructed projective identification, mutual enactment, transference, countertransference, entanglement, and the interpersonal dynamics or intersubjective dynamics of both patient and therapist, a situation calling for Model 3 negotiation of the messiness that will inevitably emerge at the intimate edge of authentic relatedness. Quite frankly, what might have begun as relatively straightforward Model 1 projection. So be thinking about when the patient has been misperceiving you and you've thought, misperception. In your own minds, think about in the last week, last month, last several months, when have you found yourself unwittingly drawn into participating? Maybe you didn't even say anything, but you could feel inside of you that you were reacting countertransferentially to the patient's projection and then interpersonal pressure on you to accept it. And your reaction, you didn't necessarily say anything yet, but your reaction then will be co-created. A story about both what the patient has done in the here and now of the analytic or therapeutic engagement, and a story about your there and then and what you bring to the moment from your unmastered early on relationships with your caregiving people. Just as it's understood that the patient's experience of the therapist in Model 3 is seen as co-created, in part a story about what the therapist just did or didn't do, said or didn't say, and the patient's inevitable reaction to that, like, duh, and their unmastered early on relational dynamics. So in Model 3, everything is co-created. And maybe they're more than just two balls back and forth. There's some ping pong balls and some pickle balls and all sorts of back and forth, back and forth. And it's tricky. It's tricky. And in my own mind, the way I think of it is, I love doing work in Model 1, in Model 2, in Model 4, in Model 5. Model 3, it's trickier. And one, may you have been in your own good experience, therapeutic or analytic experience. And two, it can be tough because you're now involved in a way that you're not involved in Models 1, 2, 4, and 5. And so I sort of think of it as, if you're getting paid for the work you do, that you're getting paid in installments to do the Model 3, where you really do want to be paid. I mean, for the most part, I'm not like ever busy doing Model 3 with all my friends. No, but in the treatment, I'm getting paid to do it, and it's sort of like, it's tough. And you will end up, though, as a result of negotiating at the intimate edge and really doing it, you end up as a therapist better for it, more evolved, more aware, more sobered, as you come to understand holding yourself accountable, because in Model 3, the goal from reenactment to accountability is you take ownership of and hold yourself responsible for, accountable for your contribution to what gets played out in your life. So that means the therapist becomes wiser for and knowing what her vulnerable spots are, blind spots, vulnerable spots, and so on. So intense, but I don't know, pretty cool. All right, where am I? Okay. So can rapidly evolve, probably down, into a far more complex Model 3 projective identification. a co-created story shaped by the therapist's less than neutral countertransferential reactivity, and therefore now implicating both patient and therapist. And in my own mind, I make the distinction, and Max Firestein does also, and others too, but between defensive reaction and adaptive response. Do you hear the difference? I mean, not just defensive and adaptive, but reaction, knee-jerk, conditioned, and response, more thoughtful, more mindful, and so on, and a corrected, more thoughtful. So from reaction, which is reflexive, to response, which is more reflective, and from reaction, which is more mindless, to response, which is more mindful. And again, the goal is not necessarily, well, get from here to here, but rather it's an ongoing process. And the way I've more recently come to think of it as a result of my own evolving is, even though I have in my time presented it as my 5 modes of therapeutic action, model 1 from resistance, the defense, to awareness, the adaptation, model 2 from relentless hope, the defense, to acceptance, the adaptation, model 3 reenactment, the defense, to accountability, the adaptation, retreat, the defense, to accessibility, availability, the adaptation, and refractory inertia or rut, the defense, to action, actualizing action, the adaptation. In truth, it's not just this or this, but rather moment by moment. And think about it for yourselves in your own life, as I think about it for myself in my own life. Stuff happens. Stressors happen all the time. And you get a letter in the mail that's upsetting. You are realizing something when you go check the stock market. Somebody says something to you. Stressors come your way, environmental stressors all the time. And what's interesting to think about is, to what extent do you react defensively because it's sort of too much for you to sort of process and integrate and respond to in a more resilient, adaptive way? So to what extent do you defensively react versus adaptively respond, whereby on some level it's more thoughtful, it's more considered, it's more evolved, it's more developed, and you respond more adaptively. And it's moment by moment. And like a good day can be a good day where a lot of stuff came your way, but you took it in your stride. And Gladys Knight and the Pips has a song, some of you who are longer in the tooth than others might remember it, and it goes, gotta make the best of a bad situation. And that's about adapting. And whereas if stuff just throws you for a loop and it's too much and not okay, then you'll defend in some way, because you're not able to process, integrate, and adapt to it. So our goal is to be able to handle with more finesse all of the stressors that will be coming our way. That's a goal. And ultimately to have a little more awareness, a little more acceptance, a little more accountability, because of course in accountability is empowerment, a little more accessibility, availability, a little more actualizing action. Okay, and in model 6, it'll be a little more accelerated flow or awakening. I think, but still working on it. Okay, I just threw that out a little seductively. All right, there you go. So where are we? So in such moments, I think when we're talking projective identification, the leading edge of the therapeutic action shifts from model 1, interpreting the patient's subjective experience, and it can change in a heartbeat. So over the course of, thank you, Nina. Okay, bye-bye, Nina. I know you'll listen to the recording. Thank you. Over the course of a session, oh my goodness, it's an hour into this. All right, over the course of a session, you're going to be not only shifting back and forth all the time, whether you know you're doing it or not, and you're also going to be making a lot of mistakes. And I do want to say, I'm not just saying that to kind of make people feel better. Quite frankly, I make so many mistakes, it's ridiculous. But the point is that it's how you process and integrate and adapt to the fact of the mistake or the misattunement or the misperception or the contribution or whatever that really makes the difference. That's really the cutting edge of deep embodied change, transformation, and growth. Okay. Okay, something about from model, I already said that. Two, model three, negotiating the intersubjective in between, where transformation emerges not through insight alone, but through mutual recognition, thank you, Jessica Benjamin, and shared accountability. Both patient and therapist ultimately taking ownership of the part each has played in the unfolding relational field. So another way to put my question to you is, over the course of the last week, months, when did you hold yourself accountable for and take ownership of some part that you had played in the unfolding relational field? It's a tough one. It's a tough one. Okay, here we go. Now, the many faces, oh my goodness, of neurotic transference and the defiance compliance conflict at its core. All right, okay. As we have seen in classical psychoanalytic theory, the therapeutic relationship becomes the stage upon which the patient's inner conflicts, unmet needs, and dysregulated affects are displaced, projected, and dramatized. More specifically, neurotic transference unfolds when patients deliver into the transference relationship aspects of their inner world that remain unresolved, unmastered, unintegrated, or, Donald Stearns, unformulated. Psychic fragments that have been defensively reinforced over time and therefore have become intensified by virtue of the fact that they have not been adequately processed or integrated into the evolving self. So stuff that isn't adequately processed, integrated, digested, metabolized will just be sort of in there. I mean, I think all of us can resonate with that experience, that if we feel a certain resentment, but we don't somehow get it said or get it expressed in some way or another, or by way of a compromise formation, which we're getting to in a second, it just sort of festers inside and eventually becomes, or that story about, I don't quite remember how it goes, but the neighbor wants to borrow a stick of butter, and so anyway, so the guy says, "Oh, okay, here, I'll bring the stick of butter to you. It's all good, no problem." And and en route to the neighbor, several houses down, he encounters so many problems along the way, including that the butter melts in his hand and it drips on his clothing, and he's so hot, and he gets lost, and he misses a phone call, and this and that, that by the time he actually gets to the neighbor, he literally just shoves it in his hand and said, "Here's your goddamn butter." All right, but anyway, so he hadn't probably wanted to do it necessarily, but it said yes. And then these other things happen, and by the time he gets there, I mean, it's become defensively reinforced as he encounters each little problem along the way, and finally, take the goddamn thing, I don't want it, and so on. So anyway, think of it for yourselves in your own life, where you had a feeling, didn't express it at the time, and then finally blurted it out in some way, later regretting, sort of, oh my God, I can't believe that I actually said that. We all do it. All right, for example, okay, when infantile id drives seeking gratification are traumatically thwarted. So again, I'm making the distinction between optimal stress and traumatic stress, and optimal stress being sort of the balance between challenge, anxiety-provoking challenge, and support, anxiety-assuaging support. A balance between those. The net result is indeed homeostatic balance and optimal stress, which I believe is going to give rise to the impetus and opportunity for there to be something that happens. That's optimal stress. That's a good thing. Traumatic stress is when in the moment in any event, it's too much. I always sort of go up high, too much. And I stand on my toes, but I'm not doing that now, but imagine that. Too much for the patient to process, integrate, and adapt to. That's traumatic stress. And the person gets all defensive and bent out of shape and some kind of conditioned reactivity and no, and not good. And familiar themes, patterns, repetitions will get delivered into what the patient is experiencing. All right, so when infantile id drives seeking gratification are traumatically thwarted by an excessively punitive superego, housing harshly critical parental introjects, they become defensively reinforced and all the more insistent over time, rendering them prone to reactivation within the therapeutic relationship. And this is the range of things that can be reactivated. More broadly, any of the following unresolved psychic elements might surface in the transference, often outside of awareness. 5 that I could find in the moment, think of in the moment. Dysregulated id impulse, a conflicted drive that defiantly, and defiance and compliance we're going to get to shortly, that defiantly seeks expression or discharge, an unmet infantile need, very similar, but a thwarted longing that yearns for fulfillment or repair, a charged derivative affect, an intensified emotion, sort of deriving from the aggression or the libido that presses for release or requires containment, a punitive superego prohibition, a harsh internal authority that demands compliance or self-denial, and or an unrealistically lofty ego ideal aspiration, a perfectionistic standard that imposes pressure to achieve the unattainable. Any of these things can be either displaced or projected. Having named the many faces of neurotic transference, we now turn to, more specifically, the inner battleground at the core of the neurotically conflicted patient. This is relevant for all of us, just as narcissistically vulnerable is relevant for all of us, or noxiously related is relevant for all of us, or non-related is relevant for all of us, or ground to a halt, refractory inertia, and non-action relevant for all of us at various points over the course of our day. So we now hone in on the age-old intrapsychic struggle between the drive to defy and the command to comply. So hearkening back to what I was saying earlier, indeed, at the heart of neurotic conflict, and more generally at the heart of human existence itself, lies this dialectical tension, a structural standoff or détente between defiant force and resistant counterforce, with the ego doing its best to mediate. So on one side, a pleasure-seeking id. This is broad strokes here, broad strokes. Now I'm going to refine it on the next slides. On one side, a pleasure-seeking id driven by defiance, and on the other, a moralizing superego intent upon securing compliance. Okay, I choose the phrase age-old intrapsychic struggle with great intention because it speaks to both the timelessness and the universality of inner conflict. It's not a modern dilemma, nor a culturally bound neurosis, but rather a perennial, deeply human conflict that every person, to some extent, confronts throughout the developmental arc of becoming who they are. And at its core lies the existential predicament of being both separate and connected. So now I'm kind of wanting to take it out of any kind of pathologizing that we might have been thinking, because neurotic tends to imply, psychopathology of some sort. But wanting to just highlight more the universality and the timelessness of this human conflict, deeply human conflict. On the one hand, the defiant wish to assert the self versus the compliant impulse to preserve connection. Or the rageful protest against constraint versus the fearful retreat into submission. Or the longing to live one's life on one's own terms, versus the dread of losing love if one strays too far afield. Each component shaping the ever-evolving dialogue between rebellion and submission, the enduring psychic tension at the core of neurotic distress. The net result of this intrapsychic standoff is a psyche torn apart inside by relentless ambivalence, the eternal conflict between defiance and compliance, between can I defy or must I comply? Can I be bad or must I be good? Beset by immobilizing indecision and a reluctance to commit, the neurotic patient hovers in a tortured in-between, a holding pattern of hope and dread, desire and fear, unable to let go, unable to move forward. It is precisely within the therapeutic relationship that this inner war will be most poignantly revived. Neurotic transferences, therefore, will emerge as the patient's simultaneous and conflicted enactment of both the hopeful pursuit of reward and the fearful anticipation of punishment. So what is fundamentally involved is displacement of force, the wishful striving for expression, release, gratification, freedom, on the one hand, and or projection of counterforce, the internal prohibitions, condemnations, restraints, fears. In this way, the therapist becomes both, at different points in time, sometimes at the same time, the longed for benevolent gratifier and the dreaded malevolent frustrator, a living embodiment of the patient's divided inner world. And yes, I mean, can this get played out in the relationship with your loved, hated one? Absolutely. It's not just in the transference with the therapist. It can get played out, period, in your life. I think we know that, but I should have clarified that. Oh my God, I love this picture. I got it off of Unsplash Pro. Here we go. The emergence of neurotic transference, whether displacement of force or projection of counterforce. Here we have the tension, internal initially, but now we're talking about when it gets one end or the other get delivered into the transference or into a relationship, and now we have a face-off. All right, unable to move forward, too late to turn back, caught in the crossfire of the psyche's civil war. Neurotically struggling, conflicted, jammed up. That's how we often think of it. Neurotically struggling, conflicted, jammed up. You know, the patient's struggling terribly. Nobody else around them is particularly struggling, but the patient is torn apart inside by reluctance to commit and struggling and this and that. And I have a number of patients where it just takes them forever and a day to decide whether they were this or whether they were that, because they're just so torn apart inside by, can I defy or must I comply? And so they're torn apart by this civil war, neurotically struggling, conflicted, jammed up. At its core, neurotic suffering is the torment of this dividedness, the ceaseless, irreconcilable inner warfare between opposing psychic forces, drive and prohibition, impulse and restraint, desire and fear, freedom and submission, held hostage by this structural stalemate. The patient is immobilized by indecision, consumed by ambivalence, and haunted by the felt impossibility of resolution. This is the suffering of the neurotic. Now, this is where I would want to say to you, sorry, it's sort of dry in here. Good. Think about Well, I think I want to say, apart from your relationships with your dear loved ones or loved hated ones, or your close relationships and so on, just things. I think I want to say that things that are in your life that you can unambivalently embrace and you're not conflicted about. Like, for example, I love to watch Judge Judy. People who know me know that I have a keen sense of justice, and I really love watching Judge Judy, Judy Justice, tribunal justice, et cetera, et cetera. I'm unambivalent about that. Other people, for example, they let themselves watch TV, but they feel that they are sitting down on the job and they're conflicted about it and they struggle. So think about, or they might love to eat something. Like, I love to eat pizza. I'm not conflicted about it. I love to eat pizza. I don't eat it very often, but I love to eat it. And so on. So you think about it. I mean, I love the Backstreet Boys. What can I say? I love Bruno Mars. I love music. I love to dance. I'm unconflicted about it. I love the water. I love the ocean. Of course, I love my dear sweet Gunner, and I love my friends, and I love living Clearwater Beach. Not that I do live in Clearwater Beach, because I'm living in Cambridge for now, but I do love living in Clearwater Beach, except for the hurricanes. But anyway, so think about what it is that you really do love, unambivalently, and there be many, many things, unambivalently. Okay, here we go. Now, to reiterate, all right, we're getting to the real good stuff in a heartbeat. So how does a neurotic transference emerge? With respect to forbidden id impulses, they will get displaced onto or redirected toward the therapist. I've already said that 100 times. In other words, dysregulated drives will be delivered into the transference by way of displacement. Whereas it was once the parent who was the object of the child's drives and tasked with either gratifying or frustrating those infantile, libidinal, and aggressive drives, it now becomes the therapist who is assigned that role. That is, comes to be experienced as a drive object, charged with holding the tension between gratification and frustration of drive. The object of the drive is no longer the infantile object, but the transference object, because the drive has been displaced from an object in the there and then to an object in the here and now. With respect to harsh, introjected superego dictates, they will get projected onto the therapist. In essence, harshly punitive injunctions will be delivered into the transference by way of projection, whereas it was once the parent who was experienced as judgmental and tasked with tightly reining in the child's dysregulated libidinal and aggressive drives. It now becomes the therapist who is assigned that role. That is, who is experienced as the critic, the judge, the one who disapproves and demands restraint whenever the patient indulges, provokes, or strays beyond the bounds of what feels morally permissible. Once this negative neurotic transference has emerged as a result of the projection, the moral arbiter of this is interesting, of bad behavior will no longer be the infantile object, nor even momentarily the patient's own superego, but rather the transference object. So let me say a little bit more about this, and then I'm going to move on to some interesting compromise formations that all of us have sort of come up with in our time. The ego has come up with in an effort to sort of play it both ways, but not really. Okay. Indeed, as some of the patient's harsh, punitive self-criticism, think about this, visualize this, is externalized and offloaded onto the therapist, the now relatively unburdened patient will experience temporary relief from internal guilt, self-reproach, or shame, because the critical judge will no longer be fully inside for the moment. When you have the patient delivering, and I'm thinking about several of my patients where this is really quite relevant, it's happening in the moment, where they are projecting something onto me and imagining, misperceiving, or if indeed they draw me into participating, imagining that I am like some version of the old bad object. All right, this externalization onto a relational figure outside the self, in this case the transference object, will function symbolically as a reversal of the process. Think of that. By which the patient had originally internalized harsh, persecutory superego interjects. Now, let me say, I did say internalized because everybody says internalized, but more technically, it should be had originally introjected, because in the literature, the psychoanalytic literature, in the purest sense of things, you internalize good by way of grieving, and you introject bad. So you do adaptive internalization of good and defensive introjection of bad. So I said internalized, but I should be wrapped by a superego or by an external something on the knuckles, because I should have said originally introjected. Harsh persecutory superego introjects or bad objects. The toxic charged affective residues are now being ejected and symbolically returned to their rightful psychic owner, symbolically. Admittedly leaving behind some kind of internal scar or whatever, but no longer sealed in permanence, frozen in time, and no longer etched into the psyche as fate. So some people just go around experiencing the world as being all sorts of bad to relieve their internal sense of themselves as bad. I mean, I guess the good news is they don't feel as bad about themselves. But the bad news is they experience the world as being not terribly friendly. And the world as being rather judgmental and critical. So, so ultimately we really need to process and work through these charged toxic boluses. Okay, good. What was downloaded whole in childhood, unnamed, unfiltered, undigested, unchallenged, because kids, they don't have an ego that's busy filtering. They just swallow it whole. Onto the quantum computer of the subconscious or the unconscious. And they're not busy sort of teasing out the wheat from the shaft. Is that it? The grain from the shaft? The grain from the shaft? I don't think I have that right, but the something from the something. It just gets swallowed whole, undigested, unchallenged, unfiltered, unnamed. But at last, it can be brought up, spat out, and returned to where it belongs. No longer lodged inside as self-condemnation, now seen, acknowledged, and expelled. A charged, toxic moral fragment excavated and forcefully released into the transference, liberating space for a now more expansive self to breathe freely. A psychic exorcism of sorts. You see, that's a reversal, symbolic reversal of what had happened to begin with. A discreet revolt against an internal saboteur, once masquerading as a psycho-educating moral guide, but in truth, a self-appointed, misguided authority, false in its claim to moral superiority. A self-righteous persecutor in disguise, demanding compliance, enforcing submission, and punishing vitality is what it had been when it's inside. But once deposited into the transference, this toxic bolus becomes available for therapeutic processing, whether as pure projection, requiring repeated interpretation, or as, and in my part 2, I'll be talking more about how classical psychoanalysis envisioned interpreting, and then James Strachey came along with the mutative interpretation, where he did something a little more, and so on. And then I'll be talking more about my conflict statement, where I'm doing something a little more still, but still relatively within the confine of Model 1. Anyway, this toxic bolus becomes available for further for therapeutic processing, whether as pure projection requiring repeated interpretation, remembering, repeating, and working through, Freud, remembering, repeating, and working through, or as co-created projective identification requiring mutual examination of the contributions from both patient and therapist. And again, even though vestiges of the scar remain, they will no longer define the self. Okay. Indeed, at their core, and now please, especially in reaction/response to this next session, please feel free to put some comments in the chat so that we can address them and all of us can kind of chuckle and laugh together. relevant for all of us, I'm quite sure. So please, please do that. And then I can address them directly in the chat, please. Indeed, to the right there, click on chat and then the little box shows up. Indeed, at their core, neurotic patients struggle relentlessly with structural conflict, neurotic conflict, a civil intrapsychic war waged between id and superego, between, on the one hand, forbidden impulses and urgent drives, and, on the other hand, the moral prohibitions that condemn them. A searing internal tension between the urge to do and the law that forbids, with the beleaguered ego caught in the middle, doing its best to mediate, to manage, to survive. All right, symptoms as expressions of neurotic conflict, also known as compromise formations. And you don't say neurotic compromise formations because by definition, this is a neurotic something. Just as, let's see if I have this right. I was told, let me just see. You don't say, as I was a little bit working on Model 6, like I said, I still have to evolve the somatic spiritual orientation of my Model 6. I think I was saying spiritual enlightenment. And I think that one is where I was correct. And so you don't say spiritual enlightenment, you say enlightenment. I think that's what it was. I know maybe people will help me on that, but enlightenment by definition is spiritual, and compromise formation by definition is neurotic. So here we go. The timeless inner struggle between force and opposing counterforce, a tense ceasefire, between longing and fear, between the drive to say yes and the need to say no, between rebelliousness and submission. I have come to appreciate that symptoms like, for example, procrastination, and so many others that we're going to get into over the course of the next some slides, are not merely lapses in willpower or flaws in character, but unconscious compromise formations, a détente of sorts. And then this is sort of my concept. Freud didn't say this, but having it both ways, but not really. Okay, good, sorry. A delay that temporarily appeases both the inner rebel, you can't make me, and the inner tyrant, do it now. Okay, I'll do it soon. It's the compromise. So compromise formations mark a battleground between can I be bad versus must I be good? The forbidden pleasure of delay versus the insistent demand to do it now. And I thank Jeffrey Melhorn for calling this one to my attention, this quote. I'm not a procrastinator. I'm just extremely productive at unimportant things. So in case any of you, and given that some of you signed up for this, an hour or two before it started, I'm a little bit thinking that, procrastination. I mean, we all, and given that I myself hadn't really completed this until an hour or two before I came online, I mean, we all to some extent do a little bit of procrastination as we're struggling between must I be good or can I be bad? All right. And please, in the chat, put some things, please, please. Other everyday symptoms can similarly be understood as subtle manifestations of this inner war. People pleasing, sort of saying yes when one feels no. So disguised aggression masked as cooperation. Sort of having it both ways, but not really. Sarcasm, sort of or telling a joke that has a little bit of an edge. Hostility wrapped in humor, a discharge of anger that remains deniable. Or the one where I have to say, this isn't sarcasm, but one that I find myself thinking about now is the woman who, rammed her shopping cart into me from behind. And whatever. I did not like that. But so later somehow, I had an opportunity to brush past her a little bit. Oh, excuse me, said I. Brush past her shoulder a little bit. Oh, excuse me, said I. So anyway, please be honest with yourselves. Think about where you have come up with some kind of compromise formation that sort of satisfies the angel and the devil. Forgetfulness, a passive aggressive refusal that dances around conscious disobedience. Self sabotage, a disguised expression of forbidden envy, rage, or defiance that operates beneath the surface of bad luck or accident. Psychosomatic symptoms. The body speaks the conflict when the psyche cannot. Thank you, Bessel van der Kolk, and many others. A migraine as a refusal, a stomach ache as swallowed rage. Uh, Lungs, tightness and constriction in the lungs as unexpressed, unacknowledged grief and heartbreak. Difficulty going to bed on time. Yeah. A quiet refusal to surrender to the day's end. A child's last stand against limits. Or a grown-up's insistence on autonomy in the face of routine. Binge eating, restrictive dieting, the oscillation between indulgence and deprivation. Can I be bad or must I be good? But again, it's all kind of conflicted and stuff because, yeah. I mean, neither one is, indulgence, super deprivation. They're like, a little tricky. These are some drives that would need to be tamed, modified, and integrated into the evolving psychic organization. What about the symptoms, said Liz? Thank you. I can always count on you, Liz. Of suicidal ideation. What about the symptom of suicidal ideation? Is that a compromise formation? Oh, okay. Well, interesting. And maybe telling people about sort of like, well, I'm thinking to kill myself. And especially you go into your therapist, they're like, well, I'm thinking to kill myself. And it's sort of like you didn't yet kill yourself. That'd be going one way. And the other is just don't even be busy saying it. But you're like busy telling people that. So that's interesting. Thank you, Liz. Yeah. Suicidal ideation. Like you didn't do it, but you talk about it. Right. Because you do feel terrible. Then talk about it. And that's a good one, Liz. Thank you. You always come up with good stuff. Thank you for that. All right. Writer's block. For any of us who've had that in our time, please, thank you, Liz. Thank you for you others. Please put stuff in the chat so that we can. That's, please, please. All right, writer's block, the pleasure of self-expression versus the fear of judgment, whether internal or external. All right, so I have one. So I had a patient who was trying to finish his damn dissertation. But he would sit down to do the writing, and lo and behold, he would be so busy thinking bad stuff about himself. Nobody's going to be interested. I'm not smart enough. I don't have this right. My whole premise is wrong. That he would spend hours and hours and hours over the course of the day seated at his desk, trash talking himself. So I said to him, well, listen, I have a proposal. I want you to commit to 4 hours of you just sit down and just fucking do it anyway. And then I want you to spend 10 hours trashing yourself and thinking about how it's unoriginal, it's not right, you've made a fool of yourself, you'll never get your dissertation done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, so the patient, well, okay. All right, 4 hours then, but I want to have those 10 hours. I said, no problem. Anyway, you can probably guess, or the 10 hours expanded into, the 4 hours expanded into 6 hours, into 8 hours. All right, so now let me tell you my delightful little story about my patient who he was approaching the 12-year mark for getting his doctoral dissertation, his PhD done at MIT. He'd been in multiple previous therapies in an effort to deal with his writer's block, and it wasn't doing it. And now we're in the 10th year. He has only 2 more years left. So he comes to me because he's heard that I work with, which is true, patients who've had previous failed therapies. So he comes to me and he says he wants to talk about, this dissertation. And I being a good little psychoanalyst, I'm sort of thinking, no, you got to talk about your childhood. So and misguidedly, I was thinking that, by the way. But anyway, so I sort of try to do that a little bit, but it's so clear that's not working. And he's already done that, and that's not where he is. So finally, I say to him, all right, well, listen, I'll tell you what. I'm going to make a deal. Oh, and by the way, he was somebody back, this was from years ago. He was somebody who kept calling me Martha. And now a lot of people call me Martha, quite frankly. But from him, anyway, we'll get to this in a moment, because clearly a doctorate was important to him. And he wasn't yet a doctor, he didn't yet have a PhD from MIT. So anyway, we'll get to that in a second. But anyway, so I said, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal. We will spend the next year and 3/4, we're going to work together. We're going to work together on your dissertation. It was in like physics beyond, so abstract, whatever. And you're going to bring the material in, and we're going to work on it together. And, not that I'm an expert in that there, but I'm logical, and I could track it and work on it with him. And we sat there literally at a table in my office. We scheduled numbers of extra sessions, and we sat there. He kept a lot of his notebooks in my office. I stored them over in the corner there. And we went over this stuff together. I said, the deal is we'll do this for the next year and 3/4. But then you need to give me 2 years worth if we're going to talk about your childhood. He said, okay, that's a deal. I said, now, furthermore, I said, for now, not only do I not want you to call me Martha, I want you, and not even Dr. Stark, I want you to call me Dr. Stark. I've never said that to anyone. But anyway, to him, I said it. You got to call me Dr. Stark. So he would call me Dr. Stark. And I get to call you, whatever his name was. I'd say it was Walter. I'll call you Walter. But when you get your doctoral dissertation, by golly, I'm going to call you Dr. Blah. And you can then call me Dr. Stark or Martha or whatever you would like. And he said, it's a deal. So let me say, we finished his dissertation. We didn't talk about defiance versus compliance. We didn't do that then. Later we did. And we finished it. And he got it. He got his dissertation. He got his doctorate. He got his doctorate. And when he did, he came in. He said, Martha. Martha. I said, yes. I said, now what do you want me to call you? I can call you Doctor whatever. I can call you Walter. He said, oh, you can call me whatever you want. It was actually very special. It was very special. And he thanked me a little bit in his, his acceptance, his doctorate ceremony. Anyway, there you go. All right. He had a writer's block. Terrible conflict. All right, how about demand avoidance? That's an interesting one. A deep-seated, often involuntary reaction to felt coercion. A persistent, often intense resistance to everyday demands or expectations, again, whether internal or external, experienced as threats to autonomy, self-cohesion, or psychic equilibrium. Demand avoidance. So somebody will say, come in here, please. I want to ask you something. And the person says, I'll be there in a moment. Or you say to your kid, dinner, I'll be there. They don't want to be told, come now. And so they show up then 10, 15, 20 minutes later. Chronic lateness. And we used to say in the psychoanalytic world, we used to say, if the patient comes early, it's because they are compulsive. If they come late to the session, it's because they're passive. No, if they come early, it's because they're anxious. If they come late, it's because they're passive aggressive. And if they come on time, it's because they're compulsive. They can't win for losing. But anyway, that's. Sometimes people object to psychoanalysis for reasons like that, sort of like you can hardly win. And let me just say, I forgot to mention in the beginning, I am Martha Stark. I forgot to introduce myself. But let me contextualize stuff here and just say, I spent years. So I got my training at the Boston Psychoanalytic decades ago, and I spent years teaching at the Boston Psychoanalytic, both first-year psychoanalytic candidates and fourth-year or final year psychoanalytic candidates. And it was interesting. It was interesting to see how they would have evolved over the course of their 3 or 4 years of instruction and being indoctrinated into psychoanalytic stuff, which back in that day was a little bit on the very classical conservative side. But whatever. All right, chronic lateness, I did that. Overspending, impulsive. Oh, good, Elan, thank you. Can therapy itself, this is a good one. Can therapy itself be a form of compromise formation between taking ownership of one's life and surrendering ownership to one's therapist? That is beautiful, Ilan Karten. Yes, I'm going to read it again for everybody. And I think I'd say, yeah, and the way some people use it, and not the way everybody uses it, but the way some people use therapy can be a form of compromise formation, or later pseudo compliance in therapy is a little lower on my page here, between taking ownership, as if taking ownership of one's life with sort of interpretations and insight and awareness, and like, oh, now I understand that I relate to the world as if they were my bad mother. Oh my God, I have that awareness. And yet surrendering ownership to one's therapist, and not even moving forward with the next step there, sort of like, well, what are you going to do about it? And just sort of delivering it all, kind of regressing into the transference, giving it all over, and not really sort of thinking about, well, that next step, which is processing it and metabolizing it and working it through in the context of either interpretation or model 3, negotiating at the intimate edge, when it turns out that there may be a little bit of countertransferential reactivity on the therapist's part. So thank you, Ilan. I love that. I love that. Okay, and we have Gina Jones. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Martha. Oh, for your generous offering. Oh, sorry, I need to leave early. And for arriving late. I'm not going to interpret that. We'll watch it in entirety later. That's very sweet. All right, folks, please leave stuff for me. Please, this is your opportunity. But anyway, going on. Okay, non-compliance with medical regimens. A patient might forget to take medications, right? I want to make sure I can see. Yeah, I can. A patient might forget to take medications, not only because of forgetfulness, but because of an internal struggle between self-assertion and submission. And I have a couple, I'm working with the woman in it, and the husband, bipolar, and really needs his mood stabilizer. And for a mix of reasons, he keeps forgetting. But anyway, their resolution for now is she reminds him every day. She kind of puts it out and then checks to make sure he's taken it. And then he does take it. But on his own, he just, he does not want to have to bow to authority and give in, submit to the will of another. But it's important enough, and he gets that he does ultimately take it. There you go. Okay, pseudo-compliance in therapy, back to what Ilan's wonderful thought there. Agreeing with interpretations while remaining inwardly unconvinced. A compromise between pleasing the therapist and defending against true change. Now, so let me also make, oh, and bulimia, yes, Gail Fox says, bulimia, yes, eating disorder, and I think that's even, oh, yes, bulimia. Guess that falls into the first category. Yes, binge eating, restrictive dieting. But yes, that's right. I mean, you get to have it, but then you feel horrible that you did it. And you're tormented inside to eat or not to eat, to eat or not to eat, binge, but oh, then maybe vomit, and eat, not eat. Yes, it's a terrible internal conflict. Thank you, Gail Fox. I appreciate that. I like that. Oh, and so we were talking about what I've come to understand is the following, and I'm leaping ahead a little bit. But if simply a cognitive interpretation, Model 1, classical psychoanalytic, is sort of offered, on the one hand, so one time one of my good people, she's a really, really good clinician who had presented to me in the SWOT supervision session, and a case, and I discuss it. And she said, I offered a really, really, really challenging interpretation where I tied together this and that and the childhood and with me now and this and that, whatever. And yeah, I did challenge the patient. Yes. So I said, did the patient feel anxious as a result? And the therapist said, oh, no, the patient loved it. Well, then that's a brilliant interpretation, but it's not a challenge. It's just brilliant, but it's not a challenge. And what I've come to understand about anxiety, and this is such a new understanding that I almost want to say, I've only had it for a few days. but I know that Ed Gutfried will appreciate this, as well as others, that in a way, if you can make the patient anxious with an anxiety-provoking challenge of their defense, of their conditioned reaction, though you also then support by landing on the side of their defense, their dysfunctional status quo. But if you make the patient anxious, that's a bodily thing. If you really make them anxious, that impacts their body. Now, I don't necessarily, because I'm not well enough trained in that, though I'm working on it, trained with Al Peso back in the 90s and later, and so on. So working on it. And, you listen to Peter Levine enough or Pat Ogden and sort of like it, and Ed Gutfried, it kind of gets into your system a little bit, gets into your body, if I could be so bold. But then in a way, when you think about anxiety as being what you one of the things that you want to be working with in the treatment, even with like Model 1, the interpretation, make them anxious. That's a bodily thing. That's a good thing. That's bodily. So when I talk about the Stark method of psychodynamic psychotherapy as being, to deep embodied healing, the embodied will have to do with many things, hopefully, but also making them anxious and then working that through. So from something that makes them very anxious to working it through. So instead of defensively reacting, adaptively responding as they work through and process the anxiety that they initially would have felt in reaction to something going on in their life or something you've said or not said, done or not done. Okay, so anxiety is a bodily thing by definition. And if we just do a brilliant interpretation, it's brilliant and that's all good and very helpful, it's all good. But that alone, and some patients, accumulate interpretations. Well, I know that I did this because of that, and I know that this because of that. And that's good. And they come back the next time and they'll say, I loved what we did. The interpretation was great. But I got home and quite frankly, I kind of lost it. I couldn't quite work it. So let's try again. And that's fine. That's all good. It's sequential. But I do believe that thing, and later another time, clearly not today, we'll talk more about no pain, no gain, that there needs to be some kind of disruption. And as Charles Krebs, a brilliant neuroscientist trained at MIT, has said, self-organizing, complex, adaptive, chaotic systems, which is what the patient's self-regulatory functions are all about, these chaotic systems, says Charles Krebs, resist perturbation, resist being disrupted. So we need to be able to offer something that will be disruptive enough, that will challenge enough the dysfunctional status quo of their defensive structures, that there's opportunity for us to gain access to what otherwise might well remain sort of unconscious and hidden, since in keeping with what Freud had originally said, our defenses initially really are unconsciously implemented by the ego, attempting to, quote, put a lid on the id and keep it out of awareness. Whew, well, I worked myself up into sweat on that one. It's now quite hot here. But let me just see what we have. Dr. Ava, thank you for updating. She's the heir of Paul and Anna Ornstein and Heinz Kohut and Ernst Wolf and the others. She's the heir. Thank you for updating and integrating psychodynamic approaches in a wonderful and creative own concept. Thank you, Dr. Ava. All right, Martha Carr says, about procrastination, I had a control case in her analytic training where my patient, a professor, was a severe procrastinator. He continuously turned his life into chaos, making people angry at him. Right, so that usually the neurotic struggle is an internal one. But quite frankly, it can absolutely get delivered into one's relationships, in which case it becomes sometimes hell for the people around them. So he continuously turned his life into chaos, making the people around him and or the people who cared about him and or the people with whom he interacted, his department or his students or what have you, his colleagues, angry at him. He took on too much. And on another side, I talk about overachievement as being another compromise formation. Overachievement, like you work too hard to excel. And that's more ego ideal, perhaps. Thou shalt overachieve. All right, let's see. He took on too much, overachievement, and then had difficulty completing things, much to the total annoyance of the people around them. And so he looked like Fairbairn's seductive, i.e., exciting rejecting or exciting abandoning. And Bill Kirwan is so savvy about Fairbairn and a million other things as well, and seductive, the exciting rejecting object. So in essence, this professor who had this internal turmoil, conflicted ambivalence, he took on too much, had difficulty completing things, much to the annoyance and outrage and upset of the people around him. He finally said to me in the treatment, I take things on, oh, with joy. I bet we're going to say that's indulgence. But at some point, I turn them into, oh, an external demand that he then has to fight against, that I have to then rebel against. Oh, isn't that interesting? Oh, thank you, Martha. Oh, thank you, Martha. That's beautiful. Thank you. I love that. Some nice work you and he did. Good for the two of you on that. And it would be interesting to see if there were some ways, any ways in which he sometimes played that out in the treatment with you. You know, he might have, asked for an extra session, and then he makes his life so complicated that he doesn't have time for it. Or some way in which he played out all that. But that's interesting. You can just feel his internal neurotic struggle and trying so hard. These are not bad people, not bad people. They're just struggling with which way to go and kind of wanting it both ways, but not really. Oh, I love that. And Jenny says, Martha, oh, can you speak to the difference between Martha Stark. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can fob it off. Martha Carr, could you speak to that? Oh, no, you mean me. All right, Martha Stark, can you speak to the difference? Oh, between compromise formation and sublimation. That is such a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant question. All right. Let me think about that. Let me say something about that. So, of course, Freud talked about, yeah, I will. Yeah, I think there is a difference. Yeah. Yes, I do. I do. Okay, so Freud, oh, that's such a good question. Oh my God, I love that. So Freud talked about the distinction, the young child playing recklessly with knives, aggressively, recklessly with knives, the little boy, and maybe it's a little girl, and she has a little gun on her little belt, and she shoots caps, and she has a knife, and she's this, that, whatever. Ultimately, as a result of evolving and the where id was, there shall ego be, or where there was structural conflict between the dysregulated horse and the inexperienced rider of the horse, between the dysregulated id and the inexperienced ego, and thus defense. Over time, as a result of working things through, and the id becomes better regulated, and the ego, the rider, becomes more experienced, what had been structural conflict becomes structural collaboration. And so the little one playing with the knives becomes a surgeon, sublimates that defense of into a sublimated, brilliant, masterful, or mistressful surgeon who operates with incredible precision. That's sublimation, harnessing the energy and channeling it into a healthy pursuit. Now, on some level, I think I want to say there, we have sublimation being the result of having done the work that needed to be done. But harnessing the now better regulated energy of the horse or the id and using it to advantage for a more worthy cause, a healthier something. And I don't see the surgeon as struggling anymore. That's a healthier transforming of defense, rigid defense, boom, 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 with the knives, into a more resilient adaptation. And that's a more successful transforming of structural conflict between id and superego and into structural collaboration. And the person is not then, the surgeon is not conflicted. They did it. Good for them. They did it. Maybe on their own. Maybe they did it in therapy. Now let's talk about compromise formation. Compromise formation is a little bit more, you have it both ways, but not really. I don't want to, can I be bad? No, must I be good? Can I be bad? Must I be good? Can I eat a whole lot? No, I can't. I'm going to binge. Then I'm going to, that's not a resolved. That's a compromise formation that for the moment does the job, I guess, but that's not where you want to end up. Being a surgeon, cutting with precision, and being sublimated, that's where you want to end up. Compromise formation is not necessarily, you're chronically late, you have demand avoidance, you have writer's block, you binge eat and then restrictive dieting, you procrastinate all the time, you're pseudo-compliant in therapy, you're non-compliant with medical regimens. Not so good. That's where you didn't work it through. And that's why we want the patient to, oh, my eyes on the time, to work it through so that they can tame the id and strengthen the ego and mitigate the severity of the superego proper. So you want to work it through in the context of a transference. So what had been structural conflict between can I be bad or must I be good? Can I defy or must I comply? That becomes tamed, modified, and integrated into a more modulated comfort with kind of doing your own thing, but also being attuned to what the expectations around you might be about. But you're not all torn up inside. You're not neurotically conflicted and jammed up. So that's a brilliant question. And fortunately, I happen to have thought about it recently. And so I hope my answer works on some level. All right, well, listen, we have a few more minutes, but I have a few more slides to get through. And then, I am going to have part 2 and I guess part 3. Let me remind people, the PDFs, and of course, I've changed the PDFs. I'm ever busy evolving my thinking. I've changed some of the PDFs. They're available, and I'll send them again tomorrow, Friday, when I send you the link for the recording. And I'll send you again the PDFs in case you didn't see them yesterday, because I kind of hid them yesterday, and a lot of people couldn't find them. And a link to my master spreadsheet, which is not for the faint of heart. It's 6 columns and more than 1,000 lines, and I kind of keep adding to it. And it has the 5 modes of therapeutic action. So I'm just going to, for example, Model 1, the optimal stressor is, let's see if I can remember this, cognitive dissonance. Notice the D. Oops, I didn't mean that finger. Notice the D. That's the optimal stressor. Model 2, the optimal stressor, what needs to be worked through is affective or optimal disillusionment. There's a D. Because all the optimal stressors, by the way, have to start with D. And they have to, it's because it's my model, and I'm saying they have to start with D, and I'm unambivalent about that. So again, model 1 is cognitive dissonance, is the between old bad and new good. And that's the thing that needs to be worked through, and that's where the heart of the therapeutic action lies. Model 2, it's optimal or affective, because model 1's cognitive, model 2's affective. Privilege is cognition, privilege is affect, model 2. Affective disillusionment, work it through by grieving. That's where the therapeutic action lies. Model 3 is relational, because model 3 is a relational model. It has to start with the letter D. Detoxification. So relational detoxification of the toxicity or pathogenicity of the projective of the pathogenic interjects that are continuously contaminating the patient's experience of the world, drawing people into participating as the very thing they were most afraid that the person would be, and yet also needing the person to be that so that they can have an opportunity to achieve belated mastery. All right, but anyway, so model 3 is relational detoxification. There's your D. That's the optimal stressor that needs to be worked through. That's at the heart of the therapeutic action in an intersubjective perspective to contemporary relational theory. Okay, now model 4, the optimal stressor will be, it can be several things, but I think that Larry Hedges and I ultimately decided on, because it's an existential humanistic approach to existential despair and easing that and facilitating the patient's dread of surrender to analytic oneness. Again, Ofra Eshel. Model 4 is existential dependence, for the patient to be able to overcome, a la Masud Khan, overcome their dread of surrender to resourceless dependence on the therapist, such that eventually, so they can absolute dependence, a la Winnicott, therapeutic dependence, infantile dependence, analytic dependence on the therapist, which that there can trust, fundamental trust. It can ultimately generalize from the small to the all. So model 4 is about helping them overcome their dread of surrender. So they're to existential dependence, or you can say their existential dread of becoming existentially dependent. So there's the D word. And finally, model 5, the optimal stressor, which is where the cutting edge of the therapeutic action is in model 5, which is a quantum neuroscientific approach to analysis paralysis or neural entrenchment, is quantum disentanglement. There's the D, or energetic or quantum decoupling. So those are the D words. Now, why did I get into all of that? But anyway, I mean, it was sort of interesting, right? All the Ds. So the defenses are all the Rs. Resistance, model 1, relentless hope, model 2, reenactment, model 3, retreat, model 4, and rut or refractory inertia, number 5. I told you that already. The A's I hinted at, which are the adaptations, are awareness, acceptance, accountability, availability or accessibility, and actualizing access. And now you know the D words: dissonance, disillusionment, detoxification, dependence or dread, and disentanglement. And there are statements that go with all 5. Conflict statements to facilitate the working through, disillusionment statements to facilitate the grieving, relational interventions or accountability statements, or the rule of 3, to facilitate model 3 working through, facilitation statements to facilitate the patients overcoming their dread of surrender to a holding environment or facilitating environment, and model 5, the quantum disentanglement or energetic decoupling statements to and so on, to help to disentangle them and extricate them from old bad, and to in their place new good. So that all 5 of my modes, I know, who knows if I only have just 2 people left, but this is being recorded, so that's a good thing. In all 5, there is the juxtaposition of old bad and new good. Old, bad, and new good, old, bad, new good, old, bad, new good, to create optimally stressful, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences, the working through of which, whether it's dissonance, disillusionment, detoxification, dependence, or disentanglement, the working through of which will be the way in which the patient evolves gradually through healing cycles from defense, rigid, to adaptation, more resilient. There you go. All right, well, let me just see here, because we are wrapping up here. And there will be a part 2. I mean, I don't know when it'll be, but it'll be. So please keep your eye out for it. Martha, I did that. Thank you so much, Jenny. I love that question. Boriana Clealer, you've presented to me before. Thank you, Dr. Stark. Till next time. Thank you. Adamar, thanks so much, Martha. So helpful and thought-provoking. Thank you for that, and I'm glad things worked out with your coming on. Judy Pillinger, thank you for coming on early, Julie. Thank you so much, Martha. Wishing everyone a continued lovely summer. And Elon, so glad I got this time around. Thank you. Thanks. And thank you, Elon, for your wonderful, wonderful, wonderful input. And Michelle, thanks for, it was wonderful and insightful. I learned a lot today. Oh, good. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, well, listen, you all. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I know you probably now all signed off, but let me just see. Did I? Yeah, there are a little more, but it was for another time. So we got to 49. There'll be more another time. Thanks for a nice workshop. Okay, that's good. All right. And Laura, thank you so much. Such a rich and clear presentation. Thank you. Well, I know, you know, those of you who teach know that in preparing material to teach, that's one of the very best ways to learn. Oh, Gail Fox says, I'm so lucky, my Dr. Stark. Oh, thank you, Gail. The best way to learn is by way of teaching. Oh, good. We do still have some people here. Teaching it. And I learned so much from preparing this material for you. So we have a lot more. Keep your eyes open. Ricardo, thank you. It was so very helpful. Excited to dig into, oh, your spreadsheet. Yes, not for the faint of heart, as I had said. That spreadsheet, it's all there. It's kind of cool. I want it to kind of be my legacy. Of course, I keep updating it. And it's on my website somewhere. It's on my website. How can I get on your mailing list? Lori, are you Lori Fiedler? I think. If you are Lori Fiedler, I'll put you on my email list. Because there was only one Lori spelled Lori, and I remember Fiedler. I like that last name. Yes, said Lori. Okay, Jenny, thank you, Martha. I'm deeply grateful for all you give us. Oh, thank you, Jenny. Okay, so listen, folks, any of you who want to sign up for my spot supervision group Zoom sessions, entirely free. They're like an hour and a half that now become an hour and 45 minutes where somebody presents a case to me. And a lot of my presenters are doing it again for the second or third time. And then I discuss it. And then people put comments in the chat. And people put a lot of comments in the chat. And then the presenter and I can address those comments. And it's such a wonderful way. I'm learning so much from these presentations. It's incredible. So you're totally welcome. So now I build them as entirely free spot supervision Zoom sessions. Even so, there are some people who write me and they say, how much do they cost? And I don't want to embarrass them by saying, well, they are entirely free. So then I say, well, no cost whatsoever. There's no charge. They say, oh, okay. And I say, yes. So these are entirely free. There's no expectation of anything. No, I'm not trying to fill out my private practice. My practice is, I'm cutting back. My practice is way too full. I'm cutting back now that I'm getting older and older. So no, this isn't about money. This is about wanting to share what I've learned over the course of decades of work with a huge number of people from ranging all sorts of diagnoses, especially ones with difficult who've been in previous treatments. And then you just kind of go for it. There you go. All right. Well, listen, oh, and Dr. Sharon, thank you, Martha, feeling grateful here. Oh, Christine Amos. Oh, thanks with a heart. I love it. All right. Well, I guess the point is, wait, let me just stop share and have the privilege, of looking at you guys. Let me tell you, there's Joe Lynn. I get to see who's still here. Don Swan, I didn't know. And Ruth from Ireland. Good, good, good. Michelle again. Yes, Gail Fox. Carol Willis. Carol, thank you for staying on to the end. Carol's in a special group. And Christine and Donna. And let's see, Ricardo. Yep. And Bill Kerwan. Oh, good, Bill. I sure hope you heard me giving the shout out to you, my dear Bill Kerwan. And Bill and I are very much alike in very many ways. We both, I hope I'm not outing you here, he and I are both very sad that Blue Bloods on TV with Donnie Wahlberg, another one that I love, is no longer on, and Tom Selleck. But Donnie Wahlberg is going to be doing a new one come the fall, and I hope Bill will watch that, and I will certainly watch it. And there's Dr. Ava still, and there's Jenny smiling, and Liz still, and smiling, Christine. Oh, look at you, dressed as you are. Look at you. Yes, and Lema. Oh, good. Hello, Lema. And Gail still. And Fiona with 3 names, and Michelle. Oh, good, Don Swan. Donna Mahoney. Oh, good, a newer person for me. Thank you, Donna. I'm so glad. And Jolynn again. Jolynn wrote a book some time ago, but it was a wonderful, wonderful book. And that's it. All right, well, you guys, I guess the point is, let me see if and I'm getting some goodbyes. God, Christine, you look great. All right, let me just see. And thanks. All right, I guess it's sort of about that time for me to be sort of wrapping this up. And thank you all. You are sort of part of my community, and I'm very grateful that you're still interested. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Ricardo, good. I get to see Ricardo. I was wondering what Ricardo looked like. Now I see you, and so on. And Lema, do I get to see what Lema looks like? No, you're Lema. Maybe yes, maybe no. All right. You don't have to show yourself, but it's kind of good. Let's see. Thanks, Martha. All right. It's about time to go. Bye-bye, you folks. Bye-bye. Ah, Fiona, thank you. 3 names.